Take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day dissolve like sugar in warm tea. The air is still, the lights dim, and somewhere far away beyond the walls of your room, beyond time itself, bell tolls softly in a village where kings once rode. Through mist and vineyards, you are about to enter France. Not the France of postcards or headlines, but a slower one, a quieter one. This is the France that remembers crowns polished by candlelight, revolutions whispered between cobblestones, emperors dreaming of glory on windswept battlefields. But tonight, you don't need to remember it all. You just need to listen, gently, as the centuries unfold like petals. One by one, we'll wander from royal courts where time ticked beneath powdered wigs, to rain-slicked alleys where revolution bloomed red and fast. We'll sip from the vineyards of Bordeaux, pass beneath Notre Dame's shadow, and fall asleep near the echo of a guillotine that long ago fell silent. Let the story carry you. Let the past rock you. Let the wine pour and the wars quiet, and let the whispering guillotine become just that whisper. This is France as a lullaby, and you are safe in its dream. Close your eyes tonight. We drift west into a land kissed by vineyards and veiled in revolution, where wine runs deeper than water, and even silence wears perfume. This is not the France of postcards, nor textbooks. This is France as the centuries dreamed it, tangled, tender, trembling. You are not here to memorize names. You are here to listen to time dissolve like sugar in tea. There will be kings in silk shoes and peasants marching barefoot. There will be revolutions that sing lullabies and blades that whisper softly. There will be painters who turn light into sleep and wars that turn sleep into smoke. But tonight, none of it will ask anything of you. Let the cobblestones echo without fear. Let the candles of Versailles burn slowly in your mind. Let the Bastille fall quietly behind your breath. France is an old lullaby, sometimes tragic, sometimes tasting of warm bread, and tonight it sings you to sleep. So breathe, and let us begin. The first breath of France is not taken in a palace or a parliament. It does not rise with a crown or fall with a flag. It begins much earlier, so early that even the stones cannot name the years. You walk now through a misty land before it is called France, before it is anything but earth and river and wind. A place the Romans will one day call Gallia. But for now, it is just Gaul, and it dreams beneath vine and cloud. You drift across open plains brushed by the golden breath of wheat. The wind here smells of damp moss and crushed grapeskins. The soil is dark, generous, slow. It holds the footsteps of tribes long forgotten by names, but not by land. Here live the Celts, though they would not have known that name. They call themselves by their own tribal words, Dewi, Parisi, Arvanai. Their lives are etched not in stone, but in rhythm, seasons, stars. Firelight. You see them gathered in wooden villages nestled between oak groves and streams, where huts are round and thatched, and stories live inside the smoke. Their world is alive with whisper and meaning. Trees are sacred, rivers are gods, and above all, the forest speaks in ways you are only meant to listen to. The Druids, keepers of memory and ceremony, do not write, but they remember. They teach. With silence, they speak through metaphor. They guide the living toward balance and the dead toward return. Time here does not move forward. It spirals, and then, one day, the spiral meets a straight road. A Roman road, a rhythm that marches, counts, builds, and conquers. You feel it before you see it, the arrival of a different kind of silence, the organized kind, the heavy kind. Legionnaires in glinting armor appear on the hills, carrying empire on their backs and discipline in their boots. And suddenly, the softness of Gaul begins to harden. The Roman world does not ask, it names. Gaul becomes a map, a province, a resource, but also, paradoxically, a home. You walk now through the city of Lutetia, small but growing, nestled along the river Seine. This is ancient Paris, long before the Eiffel Tower, before the boulevards, before romance became an industry. The Romans build bridges, aqueducts, baths, temples. They pave the roads that will one day carry chariots, then carts, then bicycles, then revolutions, and slowly, the Gauls become Roman, not erased, but rewritten. Latin replaces the tribal tongues. Roman law replaces custom. The toga is worn over old scars. But in the wine they still press, the rhythms they still sing, and the forests they still enter with bowed heads. You sense the older world still breathing. There is comfort in this merger. The Pax Romana is not peace as the Gauls knew it, but it is peace enough. Trade flows, cities rise, and in the southern region of Provence, olive trees shimmer beneath Mediterranean light. As amphitheaters echo with Latin verses, you are no longer in the shadows of the forest, but in the embrace of empire. But empires do not last, and this one rhombi begins to flicker, slowly, unevenly. The center holds, then trembles, then burns. You feel it in the northern winds, in the way the legions no longer arrive on time, in the whispers of raids, in the fear on the faces of farmers who once felt safe beneath the Roman eagle. From beyond the Rhine, from the misty lands of Germania, come new names: Franks, Burgundians, Visigoths. They do not arrive as armies, not at first. They come as drifters, settlers, wanderers with weapons. The empire calls them Parpari barbarians. But they have names, families, hunger, vision. The Roman provinces fracture, cities change hands. The language begins to twist Latin, bending beneath the weight of new tongues. And amid the ruins of what was, something new, Germanites, France, not yet the France you know, but something like a root beneath frost, preparing to bloom. You walk now beside a man named Clovisir, Frankish warlord who wears a wolf pelt and prays to no god you recognize. But he listens, he watches, he understands the power of symbol, and when he converts to Christianity in the late 5th century, everything shifts. The church, long a Roman heirloom, becomes Frankish, and in return, the Frankish sword gains divine blessing. Clovis unites tribes, he takes cities, he draws lines, he declares himself king, not just of people, but of place. King of the Franks, over land that will someday wear the name France like perfume. A kingdom is born, but it is not yet calm, not yet elegant. It is still a forested land, still rough around its golden crown. It will take centuries of war, betrayal, marriage, prayer, plague, and poetry to shape this France. But the bones are here. You pass through the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties' names, like Dagobert, Pepin, Charlemagne, trying to tame the wildness, to write law into chaos. Charlemagne, in particular, looms like a lighthouse over early medieval France. His empire stretches from Spain to Saxony. His court speaks Latin, his priests copy ancient texts, his scribes invent clearer handwriting so knowledge won't vanish into scribble. You see him crowned in Rome in the year 800 emperor of the Romans, yet not Roman, a Frank crowned by a pope, a Christian king whose sword is soaked in war, a contradiction, a prototype, a dream half-formed, and as his empire fades, the old story returns. Fragmentation. France becomes a quilt of fiefdoms and counties, each ruled by men with narrow eyes and wide ambitions. The king rules in name, but in practice, the land belongs to lords, bishops, dukes. Yet through it all, the people remain. Peasants in the north plant barley. In the south, they press wine and olive oil. Children learn to speak French, not Latin, not Frankish, but something new. A language being born as if in sleep, and over the hills the monasteries sing. The monks copy books by candlelight. They preserve what was lost. They ring bells in the dark and light fires in the cold. They hold the memory of Rome, even as wolves howl outside the cloister. You rest now at the edge of this chapter. The land is still Gaul, still Frankish, still forming, but the idea of France has begun to take shape like steam rising from a morning. Chalice, like ink soaking into a page, like vines twisting upward, slow and patient, toward light. It does not rise with fire. Not yet. It rises with roots. You rest now beside rivers that remember royalty, their waters still holding the reflection of crowns long buried beneath time. France is no longer forest alone. It is becoming stone-cut, stacked, sacred, kings walk. The land, but they do not yet rule as gods. Their thrones are carved from uncertainty, and their power is held together by oaths, not laws. You drift into the century where names begin to hold weight. The old tribes have faded into memory, and in their place, dynasties rise first, the Merovingians, then the Carolingians, then the Capetians. Each dynasty a thread braided through blood and faith, tying the land into the shape of a kingdom. Among the earliest, you find Dagobert I, resting in a tomb at St. Denis, the basilica that will become the sleeping place of kings. He is more story than man now, his name carried in lullabies and church bells. He was no emperor, but he gave France something precious, the beginning of sacred monarchy, a sense that the king is more than a man, he is the vessel of the land's destiny. Still, power slips through fingers. Eleanor's later years are marked by turmoil. Her sons Richard, the Lionheart, John Lachlan quarrel. The empire she helped build begins to crack. She is imprisoned for a time, then freed. She ages, she softens. She survives. She dies in 1204. Not as a ruler in glory, but as a figure of legend. Her tomb rests beside that of her husband in Fontevraud Abbey. Her effigy shows her not as silent, not in prayer but reading a book. Even in stone, Eleanor is thinking. After her, France does not forget. The culture of chivalry continues. It takes root in knights' training, in court rituals, in literature and legend. The Chanson de Roland echoes on battlefield lips. Chrétien de Troyes writes the tales of Lancelot and Camelot, giving future centuries the dreams of a round table and a grail dot. And in Paris, the world turns even more refined. You step into a university, classroom in the Latin Quarter. It is the 13th century. Philosophy is debated with fervor. Scholasticism is born here, a method of thought that tries to balance faith with reason. Thomas Aquinas will pass through these halls. Abelard and Hilo say will write love letters that will outlast flesh. Paris becomes the mind of Europe, curious, restless, radiant, and yet the chivalric dream is not without shadows. The Albigensian crusade, launched in southern France, becomes A war not against invaders, but against heretics, fellow Frenchmen with unorthodox beliefs. Cities are burned, songs are silenced, courts vanish. The same land that once nurtured troubadours now echoes with screams. Idealism can be fragile, and culture, even at its brightest, can be turned against itself. Still, Eleanor's legacy is not broken, just folded like a letter placed under a pillow. Like a smile remembered after waking, you leave this chapter carrying not the weight of crowns or castles, but the shape of a dream of France that believes not just in power, but in beauty, in tenderness, in the soul's right to sing. This was the age of Eleanor, the age of poetry in armor, the age when love was law. You lie down now in a garden she once walked, where violets bloom and lutes whisper, and you sleep courtly and slow. The skies darken slowly, not with sudden storm, but with a steady, whispering grey that stretches over decades. You drift now into a time when France forgets what peace feels like, when the calendar turns and turns, but the war stays unchanged, unwelcome, and somehow familiar. This is the 100 Years' War, though no one calls it that yet. To those who live through it, it is simply life. War is not a single clash, but a long sigh between kings. It is born of disputed thrones, of dynasties tangled like vines. But what begins in blood becomes a rhythm sage, retreat, famine, treaty, repeat, a lullaby of slow collapse. You float now over battlefields that do not yet know they will be. Remembered over Crécy, where English arrows fall like rain on French knights who shine too brightly. Over Poitiers, where a king is captured and ransomed like a jewel. And over a place called Agincourt, where the mud swallows pride and the longbow rewrites destiny. But let us go back. Let us begin where the fear begins. In the death of a king, the French crown is passed from Philip IV to his son, and then again, and a Guinich king falling before his time like a candle left in wind. By 1328 there is no direct male heir. The throne wavers, and from across the Channel, the King of England, Edward III, stakes his claim. His mother was a French princess. He believes the bloodline flows true enough, but the French nobles disagree. They raise their own King Philip VI, cousin to the late monarch, and so the game begins. A chessboard soaked in mud. You watch the first battles unfold, not with fire, but with gold. Fleets are built, alliances bought, cities fortified. The first phase is swift. Edward wins great victories. French nobles fall, but nothing ends. Every peace is temporary. Every truce a pause between storms. France, you notice, begins to frame just at its borders, but at its soul. The peasants are overtaxed, their fields trampled by passing armies. Famine sets in, then plague. The Black Death arrives like a shadow, too large for the sun to outpace. Bodies are piled in the streets. Churches echo with hollow prayers. Entire villages vanish. France bleeds, not from swords, but from silence. And still, the war goes on. You pass through decades, like pages of the same letter. Kings change, treaties are signed and broken. The English crown now holds more of France than the French king himself. And in Paris, hope begins to curl inward, like paper in flame. Then a voice, soft, unsure, but certain enough to change everything. A peasant girl, born in the quiet village of Domremy, hears whispers she believes are divine. Her name is Joan of Arc. She says that God has chosen her to lift France from its knees. She says that she must see the Dauphin crowned at Reims.u. Watch her walk into history barefoot, not as a soldier, not as a noble, but as something entirely other. She is young, just 17, but her certainty burns through armor. She is given command. She rides to Orleans, where the siege has dragged on too long, and somehow she lifts it. The English retreat, the French spirits stir. Joan becomes not just a figure, but a symbol. And then she does what no one has dared. She takes the Dauphin Charles VII to Reims. There, amid solemn candles and the echo of centuries, he is crowned king, not because of blood, or right, or politics, but because a girl believed. You watch the coronation through Joan's eyes. The gold, the incense, the tears. She has done what warriors could not, and yet her story is not destined for peace. In 1430, she is captured, betrayed, sold to the English, put on trial, not for crimes of war, but for heresy, for claiming to hear what no man could verify, for wearing armor, for being a woman too powerful to ignore. The trial is a cruel theater. You hear her voice clear, unshaken, young. They ask trick questions. She answers with grace. But the verdict is written before the questions end. In 1431, Joan is burned. At the stake in Rouen, not as a warrior, not even as a heretic, but as a threat. You imagine the fire, the silence after, the wind that carries her ashes into the sky over France, and yet her voice does not vanish. 20-5 years later, her trial is nullified. She is declared innocent. Centuries after that, she becomes a saint, and today she remains one of the few whose shadow still walks beside France. You drift now through the final years of this endless war. France, guided by Charles VII, begins to rebuild. The English retreat, the land heals, slowly. And by 1453, the war is over. No peace treaty, no final trumpet, just silence. France remains, tired, changed, but intact. You breathe beside the ghosts. The ghost of Joan, who walked like a flame. The ghost of children never born in plague years. The ghost of fields once red, now green again, and you feel something return. France has waited not just 100 years for peace, but for a kind of clarity, a sense of self, not as a patchwork of nobles, but as a nation. You lie now in that soft clarity. The rain has stopped. The waiting is over. Sleep comes gently now. Morning doesn't come all at once, not after such a long grey storm. Instead, it rises slowly, one brushstroke of light at a time. And so it is with France after the 100 Years' War. It does not leap into brilliance. It glows into it, like the dim warmth of a hearth rekindled after a bitter night. You move now through a land that is battered but breathing again. The war has ended. The fields are growing green. And the people, weary from a century of waiting, begin to look upward, not in fear, but in curiosity. This is the Renaissance, though France does not call it that yet. And though Italy burns bright with it first, you feel it now beginning to flicker northward, toward the valleys of the Loire, toward the spires of Paris, toward the ink-stained fingers of scholars and the marble dreams of sculptors. You drift into the court of Charles VII, who holds his throne thanks to a girl who heard voices and a country that found its voice. He is cautious, practical. He rebuilds not with fire, but with policy. He lays the foundation for royal taxes, for a standing army, for a France that can stand alone. And then comes Louis XI, the Spider King. You follow his steps through corridors lined with secrets. He is not charming, nor beloved, but he is clever. He weaves alliances like webs. He curtails the power of nobles. He plants the seeds of centralized rule. Underneath his cloak, you sense something new, a modern mind, thinking in strategies rather. Then Swords France is beginning to unfold. You feel it in the architecture first. Castles, once built only for war, begin to bloom with windows, with gardens, with grace. The Loire Valley becomes a cradle of aesthetic awakening. Chateaux like Chambord and Amboise rise not as fortresses, but as statements. Here is a France no longer merely defending, but expressing. You enter one of these rooms, filled with tapestries, candlelight and books. Books, at last, are everywhere. The printing press arrives, and with it, the liberation of language. No longer is knowledge sealed within monastery walls. It flows into cities, into schools, into the hands of the curious. You visit the Sorbonne, where scholars debate Aristotle, and scripture, you hear the early murmurs of humanism, the belief that man, not just God, can be the measure of meaning, that the world is not just a waiting room for heaven, but a canvas for wonder. French begins to flower as a literary language. Poets like Francois Villon capture life in its gritty, aching, beautiful fullness. His words are sharp and street-worn. They speak of hunger and youth and the fleeting nature of love. You feel France becoming self-aware, not just as a nation, but as a voice. And then comes a young king with golden hair and dreams shaped like Italy. Francis I. It is he who will fling open the window of the Renaissance fully. Under his rule, art is not only embraced, it is invited. He brings Leonardo da Vinci across the Alps, gives him a home. Let him die in Amboise, under French stars. He builds the glorious Château de Fontainebleau, whose walls echo with laughter, debate, and frescoes. You walk alongside Francis through galleries and libraries. He is a king of elegance. He sees culture as strength. He supports painters, architects, scholars, and he declares that French not Latin shall be the language of law. It is a quiet revolution, a turning inward. France is beginning to speak, in its own tongue, for its own destiny. But even in this flowering, there are shadows. The Reformation begins to shake Europe. Luther writes his theses. The church wobbles on its old throne. And in France, new cracks form not in stone, but in faith. You hear whispers of Huguenots, French Protestants, reading banned texts by candlelight. Tensions simmer between them and the Catholic majority. A new kind of war begins to flicker. On the horizon, one not of land or titles, but of belief. But not yet, for now you breathe in this moment where light enters through stone, where stained glass is not just decoration, but philosophy, where to paint a body is to praise creation, where to write a poem is to touch the divine. You walk through a garden planted not just with roses, but with ideas. The Renaissance in France is not a roar. It is a soft blooming dot, a prince reading Plato by a river, a mason carving leaves into limestone, a girl reciting poetry in a dialect no longer called vulgar, but beautiful. France has begun to believe in itself, not just in heaven, but in here. And as night falls, you lie down in the quiet of a candlelit room, the pages of a book still warm in your hands, the stars above whispering their own version of geometry. The world has not yet found peace, but it has found light, and you sleep beneath it gentler now, and dreaming, You enter now the part of the dream where the light flickers. The Renaissance glow has warmed the soul of France, but it has also stirred deep shadows. Ideas that once bloomed as flowers now turn sharp as blades. Faith, once a source of comfort, becomes a spark in dry grass. This is the age of the wars of religion, when France begins to tear at its own chest. You walk slowly through the years, careful not to disturb the silence. The ground is soft, like ash. The churches stand tall, but their bells no longer ring for all it begins. As many wounds do, with belief, the Protestant Reformation sweeps across Europe like a storm blown in from the east. In Germany, Martin Luther pins his 95 Theses to a door. In Geneva, John Calvin shapes a sterner doctrine, discipline, simplicity, faith without ornament. These ideas reach France like whispers at first. Then, like fire, the Huguenots, French followers of Calvin, begin to grow in number. They read scriptures in the language of the people. They meet in homes, in secret, in prayer. To them, salvation does not require a priest or a pope, only a heart turned toward God, to the Catholic crown. This is not reform. It is rebellion. And so the centuries-old unity of France, the union of church and crown, altar and throne, begins to crack. You feel it in the streets of Paris, where sermons grow sharper. You hear it in marketplaces, where neighbors eye each other with suspicion. The First War begins in 1562, when royal troops massacre Huguenots in Wassy. It is not the first act of violence, but it is the first that echoes. The years that follow are not one war, but 8, stretching across decades like a tapestry woven from grief. You walk through towns where churches are torn apart, stained glass shattered, altars desecrated, statues beheaded, not from hatred of God, but from a desire to purify his image. Each side believes they are defending the truth. Each side sees the other not as neighbor, but as heretic. Each side prays before battle. The war is not only about religion. Power weaves itself through every prayer. Noble houses align with faith for gain. The monarchy struggles to contain the blaze, and always the people suffer. You pass by fields sown with bones, cities burned and rebuilt, only to burn again. You hear mothers begging the sky for their children's safety. You see refugees crossing rivers with nothing but names. Then, one night, a bell rings in Paris, not for worship, not for celebration, but for blood. It is August 23rd, 1572, the eve of the wedding between the Catholic Princess Margaret of Valois and the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre. The marriage is meant to heal the wound, to bind two halves of France into one, but the wound is too deep. That night begins the St. Bartholomew's Day. Massacre. You cannot stop the dream now. Thousands of Huguenots are slaughtered in the streets, not by soldiers alone, but by citizens, by neighbors. The Seine runs dark. The air grows heavy with smoke and silence. It spreads to other cities. The massacre becomes a shadow stitched into the fabric of France, and yet somehow life continues. The wars stretch on, kings die, princes rise, but none can restore the peace, until one man makes a choice so quiet. It sounds almost like surrender. Henry of Navarre, the same Protestant who survived the massacre, becomes king in 1589, Henry IV of France. But the crown weighs differently now. He knows what it means to rule a fractured soul, and so he does the unthinkable. He converts from Protestant to Catholic for peace. He says, Paris is well worth a mass. It is not a betrayal. It is a bomb, and in 1598 he signs the Edict of Nantes, granting Protestants the right to worship, to hold office, to live without fear. It is not perfect, but it is a beginning. You breathe deeply now, the air less thick. The fires still smoulder, but they no longer rage. The cathedrals are still cracked, but their bells ring again, and the people, what is left of them, begin to plant seeds instead of graves. France has not healed, but it has chosen not to keep bleeding. You lie down beneath a sky slowly turning blue. The ghosts are quieter now, the prayers softer. You sleep, with a memory of sorrow, but also with a thread of grace winding through your dreams. You rise now into the warmth of a different kind of light, not the soft dawn of peace, but the blinding noon of ambition. France has survived war, plague, division, and now, in this stillness, something else begins to bloom, majesty, not whispered in chapels or carved into castles, but performed every day. Like a ritual, you drift into the court of a boy who will become more than a king. He will become an image, a symbol, a son. Louis XIV. He inherits the crown in 1643 at just 4 years old, his kingdom fragile and frayed from war. While he plays with toy swords, real ones clash in the streets. The Fronde, a series of noble rebellions, shakes the palace walls. The memory of those uprisings etches itself into his childhood, and he grows not only into a ruler, but into a ruler who will never forget. By the time he takes power fully in 1661, he knows exactly what he wants. Absolute monarchy, a crown that shines alone, unquestioned. I am the state, he will one day say, and the world will believe him. You float now through the early years of his reign, where decisions become architecture and authority is cast in marble. You feel France pulling itself into an orbit around a single point. Louis himself. He dresses in gold. He dances in ballets. He signs every decree with a flourish. But this is not vanity. It is strategy. He understands that visibility is power, that if he becomes the sun, all others must revolve around him. Nobles are no longer warriors in their provinces. He gathers them slowly, irresistibly, into a new palace, a place called Versailles. You approach its gates. The air is sweet with manicured stillness. Fountains rise in perfect arcs. Gardens bloom in straight lines. Inside, mirrors stretch like light into eternity. Every inch of it is designed not just for beauty, but for control. Versailles is a stage. Louis is both playwright and lead actor. And you, like everyone else in France, watch the performance unfold. You drift through the daily rituals, the lever, where nobles watch the king wake, the coucher, where they watch him go to bed. You see dukes and counts competing not for land, but for the honor of holding a towel. Everything is choreographed. Everything is observed. This is how Louis rules. Not with constant violence, but with presence. He becomes a fixed star, and the closer you are to him, the warmer your life becomes. But there is more than theater here. There is structure. Under his hand, France transforms. Roads are built. Trade expands. Colbert, his finance minister, promotes manufacturing and a kind of economic nationalism. France becomes not only admired, but feared. Art flourishes too. You walk past the paintings of Charles Le Brun, past the tapestries of the Gobelins, past the dramas of Racine and Molière, who were given stages and applause by the crown itself. Louis turns culture into policy. He is not just king of a country, he's is the architect of identity, but identity has borders, and Louis is not content to remain within his bars. Begin not all at once, but steadily. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and finally, the long and grinding war of the Spanish Succession. Each war begins with logic. Each ends with exhaustion. You walk now through muddy trenches, through towns razed and rebuilt, through endless scrolls of taxes that fall hardest on the poor. The gold of Versailles is paid for with sweat from provinces that will never see its chandeliers. And then, amid it all, a decision that shakes even the loyal on in 1685. Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes, which had given Protestants the right to worship. He declares one king, one faith. Thousands of Huguenots, flea merchants, scholars, artisans staking their knowledge with them. What seemed like unity becomes a hollowing. You see the paradox now. Louis brings glory to France, but it is a heavy glory. He makes the state elegant but brittle. He lifts the nobility but cages them. He expands the borders but stretches the soul. Still, he persists. For 72 years, he reigns longer than any monarch in European history. Generations live and die beneath his shadow. He becomes less man than myth, and finally, in 1715, the sun begins to set. You are there, at Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors. The air is heavy with perfumes and unspoken thoughts. Louis is old now, his legs swollen, his spirit slower. He dies not in battle or exile, but in his own bed, surrounded by courtiers who do not yet know what comes next. And when he dies, something in France exhales. The spell breaks, the center shifts, but the dream lingers. You lie now in a quiet room, lit by the last gold of that long reign. The curtains are velvet, the air is still, and through the window you see the gardens Louis once walked. They are silent now. The fountains sleep. France has been shaped by hands that loved power, by a king who became a son, by a palace that remembered every performance. The next chapter will be different, but for now you rest in the golden hush and sleep beneath the gilded echoes of a world that dared to orbit one man's dream. Now the lights dim, but something else glows. Gold, but thought. You drift through a new kind of darkness, one where the quiet is filled not with fear, but with questions. After centuries of crown and cross ruling side by side, a new voice stirs, curious, clear, and defiant in its gentleness. This is the Enlightenment, and France is at its heart. You walk through Paris by moonlight. The streets are cobbled, the air heavy with pipe smoke and the rustle of newspapers. Inside certain salon-wide rooms filled with velvet chairs and slow-burning fireplaces, men and women gather not to gossip, but to think. Here, ideas are the wine poured freely. Here arguments flow like music. You listen to the philosophers, the philosophes, not as distant names, but as voices in the next room. You hear Voltaire, sharp and smiling, asking why power must fear the pen. You hear Montesquieu, speaking of laws, like rivers each, shaped by the land they flow through. You hear Diderot assembling a new kind of cathedral, one built not from stone but from knowledge, the encyclopedia, a compendium of everything a mind might dare to know. It is more than ink. It is rebellion, whispered page by page. You visit the workshops where printers risk prison for publishing these words. The books are small enough to hide, dense enough to ignite whole hearts. The king's censors try to keep pace, but the flood of thought cannot be dammed. Reason has found a printing press, and truth, once shackled to dogma, now wears the robes of debate. And yet, you see no torches, no mobs, not yet. This revolution begins not with riots, but with reflections. Voltaire travels to England and returns with a vision of tolerance, of checks on power. He writes not to flatter rulers, but to remind them they are human. He mocks cruelty with elegance. He defends freedom with wit. Montesquieu studies ancient laws and discovers something radical, that power must be divided to stay just. His words will echo far beyond France, into America, into history. And Rousseau, you hear him last, perhaps deepest. He walks alone more often than he speaks in salons, but when he writes, it is with fire. He tells you that society corrupts, that man is born free but is everywhere in chains, that there is a contract between people and their rulers, and that contracts, when broken, must be rewritten. These are not just books, they are mirrors held up to a monarchy too gilded to see its own face. You walk through Versailles again, but now it feels different. The gardens are just as symmetrical, the mirrors just as vast, but something trembles beneath. The polish. The nobles laugh louder now, as if to silence a fear they cannot name. The common people are reading, to dot in cities, in cafés, in the space between work and hunger, words are passed like bread. A generation is growing up with less reverence for thrones, more hunger for reason. They no longer see the king as sacred. They see him as a man, and men can be questioned. Still, the monarchy does not yet feel the flames. Louis XV reigns with a kind of weary indulgence. His court is elegant, detached, luxurious. He speaks softly, if at all. His mistresses hold more sway than ministers. He senses the growing unrest, but shrugs it off. A prise, moi, le déluge. He says, after me, the flood. And the flood is coming. But tonight, it is still quiet. You pass through the home of a widow teaching her children to read by candlelight. You watch a merchant debate with a priest about taxes and faith. You sit in the back of a salon where a woman hosts Madame Frin, perhaps gathers minds like roses for display. This is a slow revolution, built of syllables and sighs, and above it all you feel a shift. France is beginning to believe in itself again, but not as kingdom, as people. The soul of the nation no longer sits on a throne. It walks the streets. It argues in libraries. It whispers at midnight. Even in the colonies, though, distant and changed, the thoughts find cracks in every wall. Enlightenment is no respecter of borders, and yet not everyone welcomes it. The church grows uneasy. The crown feels watched. Censors sharpen their pens. Prisons tighten their bars. But it is too late, thought, once freed, cannot be buried. You return to your quiet room, the window ajar, the stars above you like ink on parchment. The air feels different, now, like something is waiting, like a page is about to turn. France is dreaming again. But this time, the dream is not of kings, it is of justice, of reason, of a world remade, not by decreed, but by understanding. And you fall asleep, not with fear, but with wonder, because some revolutions begin not in fire, but in the way a single candle lights a room. You stand now on the edge of a cliff disguised as a street. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones of Paris pulse with something deep, something restless. The salons are still lit with conversation, but in the alleyways and bakeries, the words are no longer poetic. They are urgent. The Enlightenment has given France new eyes. And now the people begin to look around. What they see is hunger. What they see is a crown drowning in gold, while children cry for bread. What they feel is not awe but rage, and what rises now is not a theory but a roar. You move through the last days of Louis XVI, a king who never wanted a crown heavy with this much history. He is shy, indecisive, a watchmaker at heart, a man more comfortable with gears than governance. He inherits a nation swollen with debt, bruised by war, and fueled by books he never read. Beside him, Marie Antoinette glides through the gilded halls of Versailles. The people call her extravagant, callous, let them eat cake. They say she said she didn't. But the myth grows louder than the truth. Outside the palace, France simmers. The price of bread rises, wages stagnate. The winter is cold, and revolution is not yet a march, is a whisper. Why should kings feast while we starve? Why should birth decide power? You drift now into the year 1789. The monarchy, desperate to avoid collapse, calls together the Estates General, a body not summoned in nearly 2 centuries. It includes the 3 estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, the third estate. This everyone else is 98% of France, and now they want a voice. When their demands are ignored, they break off, and in a tennis court, not a palace, they swear an oath. They will not disband until France has a constitution. You can feel it. The quiet has cracked. Then comes July 14th. The air is thick. The people are marching. And they turn toward a fortress that has long stood as a symbol of tyranny, the Bastille. You are there when they storm it. The crowd is wild, not professional soldiers, but butchers, bakers, seamstresses, apprentices. They take the prison not for who it holds, but for what it means. And when the gates fall, a nation rises. The French Revolution has begun not with a vote, but with an act of fury. You drift through its first days, where hope and chaos walk hand in hand. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is written light, poured into language. It promises liberty, equality, fraternity. It believes that every human being holds something sacred inside, something no crown can buy or sell. But ideals are fragile in the storm. You float through Paris in October, when women march from the city to Versailles not in protest, but in desperation. They demand bread. They demand justice. They drag the royal family back to Paris, not in chains, but in shame. The king is no longer a sovereign. He is a symbol, shrinking dot, and the revolution turns inward. Factions, Jacobin, Girondins, Royalists, Radicals. One voice begins to cut through the others, Robespierre. He believes in virtue, but his virtue is sharp, edged. You arrive now at the reign of terror. The guillotine stands in the center of the city like a grim clock. It ticks with each execution, and in this time, even whispers can be fatal. Louis XVI is tried and executed. His wife follows. Thousands die in the name of purity, and yet even as the revolution devours its own, France is changing. Feudalism ends. Titles are abolished. Laws are rewritten, streets are renamed. A republic is declared, but the republic trembles. You move through smoky rooms where committees rule with fear, through villages where churches are shuttered, bells melted, faith turned into silence. The revolution promised light, but sometimes it brings fire instead. In 1794, the guillotine turns on Robespierre himself. The terror ends, and what remains is not clarity but exhaustion. France is leaderless. It is bruised and breathless, but it is also awakened. It has tasted power in the hands of the people, and it will never be the same. You lie now beneath a shadow of something enormous, something still undefined. A republic gasping for air, a monarchy buried, a people unsure what comes next. But the dream remains, that all men are equal, that freedom is worth a storm, that a better world is not impossible, only unfinished. And as the sky turns over Paris, and the blood is washed from the cobblestones by morning rain, you feel something gentle returning, a silence not of defeat, but of rebirth. You fall asleep, beside the ghost of liberty, still holding her torch. Even in the dark, the fire has died down, but its warmth lingers in the stones. You drift now through a France that has survived its own storm. The monarchy is gone, the terror has passed, the people are weary free but uncertain. Liberty has been proclaimed, but what does freedom look like in practice? A new silence gathers over the land, not of peace, but of hesitation. And then, through the smoke, he appears, Napoleon Bonaparte. You don't see him at first as an emperor, you see him as a soldier, a child of Corsica, born not to nobility but to ambition. His voice is quick, his handwriting small and restless. His eyes do not wander, they calculate. He is a boy who reads history by candlelight and imagines himself in it. You follow him through the early years of his rise. He is young, just 24, when he is given command of French forces in Italy. There he defeats the Austrians and reshapes borders like a chessboard. France watches, stunned, not just by victory, but by style. Napoleon doesn't march like other generals. He moves quickly, thinks boldly, speaks like a man writing his own myth, and the people, longing for stability after years of revolution, begin to believe in him. You drift through the days of the Directory, a fragile government riddled with corruption and indecision. It rules France, but cannot command it. In that vacuum, Napoleon's star rises higher. In 1799, he returns from a failed expedition in Egypt, his military ambitions, they're sunburned, unbroken, but he doesn't return in defeat. He returns with scientists, with artists, with stories. He understands something deeper than conquest, narrative. He stages a coup swift, and bloodless sand takes power as first consul. The Republic still stands in name, but it now leans on the will of one man, and France exhales, because this time, the leader is not born into luxury. He is self-made, and he promises what they crave: order, strength, glory. You watch as he rebuilds the legal system with the Napoleonic coda, new structure of laws that gives clarity and modernity to justice, property rights, civil liberties, the idea that law should be written and equal. You visit schools built under his reign. He wants education, not for revolutionaries, but for administrators, engineers, soldiers. He wants France, not chaotic and passionate, but trained. And yet, all the while, his eyes look outward to Austria, to Prussia, to Spain, to Russia. The map begins to bend under his ambition. In 1804, he crowns himself emperor, not by divine right, not with trembling humility, but with his own hands. You are there in Notre Dame Cathedral. The Pope watches silently as Napoleon lifts the crown and places it on his own head. It is a gesture of boldness, a symbol that says, "I answer to no one but history." What follows is a series of wars that reshape Europe. You drift through Austerlitz, where the fog lifts, just long enough for Napoleon to crush the combined forces of Russia and Austria. You pass through Jena, Wagram, Friedland battles where his brilliance blazes like lightning across the fields. France follows him, enthralled, and yet, as his empire grows, the burden grows with it. You visit homes darkened by Lowe's sun's scent, to fight, never to return. You hear rumors whispered behind closed shutters of censorship, of dissent crushed, of prisons not called prisons. The dream of liberty is still spoken, but it wears a uniform. Now. Then comes the first stumble. Spain. You drift through dusty roads where Napoleon's armies meet a people who refuse to bow. Guerrilla warfare bleeds his forces slowly. The Spanish resistance becomes a thorn, and the war becomes a quagmire. And then Russia in 1812. He marches east with over 600,000 men. The Grand Army, they cross into Russian territory with pride, with precision. But the land itself turns against them. The Russians retreat and burn. Winter arrives like a silent general. You feel it in your bones. Snow falls, supplies dwindle, horses die, soldiers freeze in their sleep. By the time Napoleon retreats, fewer than 100,000 men remain. France gasps. The myth begins to fracture. Other nations rise. Coalitions form. And in 1814, Paris is invaded. Napoleon abdicated. He is exiled to the island of Elba. You might think the story ends here, but he returns in 1815. He escapes Elba and marches back to France. Soldiers sent to stop him instead join him, cheering. No blood is spilled. No shot is fired. He reclaims power for 100 days. And then, at Waterloo, the final curtain falls. He is defeated by the combined forces of Britain and Prussia. This time, there is no return. He is exiled again farther, to St. Helena, a lonely island. In the Atlantic, he dies there in 1821, not as a conqueror, but as a memory, writing his own legacy with trembling hands. And France, what of France? It is scarred, changed, but not broken. You lie now beneath a quiet sky, far from cannon smoke. The empire is gone, but the code remains. The institutions remain. The idea that anyone, no matter how small, might rise that remains to Napoleon. Cast a shadow over Europe, but he also cast a light. And in that contradiction, France learned not just how to follow a man, but how to carry forward the questions he left behind. You sleep now beside the echo of drums, but also beside laws, roads, and stories that never marched back into the sea. The emperor is gone, but the world he shaped still turns beneath your feet. You wake beneath quiet skies, but something is different. The cannons have gone silent. The flags no longer wave in conquest. Napoleon's boots have stopped echoing through Europe, and in their absence, the old world tries to breathe again. But it is a fragile breath so low, unsure. France stands on uneven ground. The emperor has been exiled to a speck in the Atlantic, and into the silent steppes a familiar shape, a king. The year is 1814, and the Bourbon dynasty returns from exile like a ghost slipping back into its own portrait. Louis XVIII, brother of the beheaded Louis XVI, now takes the throne, not by conquest, not by glory, but by negotiation. By necessity, you drift through his coronation, not triumphant, but tentative. He does not walk as a monarch of old. He tiptoes across the ashes of revolution, mindful of the cracks beneath his feet. The people watch in silence. They do not cheer. They do not revolt. They remember. They remember the guillotine. They remember the Republic. They remember the man who crowned himself. And so Louis XVIII must walk carefully. He issues a charter, a kind of constitutional promise. There will be a parliament. There will be some rights. He does not rule by divine right alone. The age demands compromise, but you feel the tension. Wires strung too tight across the air. France has changed. It no longer bows instinctively. It listens, it judges, it waits. It is no longer a child ruled by nobles, it is a nation full of witnesses. And then, just as the new order begins to find its rhythm, the drums beat again. Napoleon returns. Just for a flicker of final flame, he escapes Elba, marches across France, and for 100 days, the old rhythm returns. Soldiers rally to him. Towns open their gates. The king flees. The people, unsure, hold their breath. Then Waterloo, and it is over, truly over. This time Napoleon is sent Father Saint. Helena does not return. The monarchy resumes, but it feels less like a reign, more like a placeholder. You follow Louis XVIII through the final years of his life. He tries to balance the old world and the new. Nobles want their power back. Liberals want more freedom. The king, sick and tired, tries to appease both and satisfies neither in 1824. He dies, and now another king steps into the dream, Charles X, younger brother of Louis XVI, older in body but not in mind. He does not walk cautiously. He walks as if nothing has changed. He restores nobility. He restores church power. He believes monarchy should be absolute again. But France no longer lives in that mirror. The people watch, and the memory of the revolution sharpens in their bones. Then, in 1830, Charles signs the July ordinances, dissolving the parliament, restricting the press, and tightening his grip. He believes he can silence dissent by decree. Instead, he ignites it. You drift into the July Revolution, 3 days that shake. The crown from his head. The streets of Paris rise again. Barricades form like scars reopening. The people chant, not for Napoleon, not for God, but for France. Charles flees. His reign ends not in glory, but in exile, and now something new. The people, bloodied, but wiser, do not abolish the throne. They reshape it. They crown Louis Philippe, a distant cousin, as king of the French. Not king of France. A quiet difference, but a powerful one. He rules by the will of the people, not by the grace of God. It is monarchy made modern, crowned but cautious. You drift through his reign. He dresses like a bourgeois gentleman, walks without ceremony, surrounds himself with bankers and merchants. He promotes industry, builds railroads, expands the middle class. But in the shadows, the working poor wait. They watch the new riches rise without reaching them. They remember that revolution once tasted like hope. By the late 1840s, the tension sharpens again. The king resists change. The people demand more voice, more dignity. And then February 1848, the streets rise once more. Louis Philippe flees in disguise. The monarchy collapses, not with fanfare, but with footsteps in the dark. This time, there is no king waiting in the wings. France declares a second republic. You pause now in this quiet space between dreams. You have witnessed kings restored and removed. You have seen altars rebuilt and torn down. Through it all, the people have changed. They do not forget. Every crown placed upon a head carries the weight of memory. The revolution was not a single event. It was a heartbeat pulsing through every decade, a rhythm of rise and fall, hope and recoil. And so you sleep now, not beside a king, but beside a nation that has begun to shape itself. France has not found its final form, but it has found its Voice, you drift off in the quiet aftermath, where no anthems play, but the people begin to hum their own. Now the storm has passed again, and the air is full of soft rubble, political, emotional, historical. You lie quietly in the dusk of a country that has worn so many masks, a kingdom gilded in ceremony, a republic built in fire, an empire marching through fog. But France still isn't finished dreaming. There is one more chapter of illusion to live through, one more crown to try on before finally laying it down. This one arrives not on a battlefield or in a cradle, but in the memory of a name, Bonaparte. The year is 1848, and the Second Republic has barely drawn its breath when the people vote overwhelmingly to elect a president. They could have chosen a statesman, a philosopher, a voice of reason, but instead they choose a name, a shadow, a myth. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Napoleon, rides not in on promises but on echoes. He is quiet, unreadable, polite, but behind his gaze, something restless stirs. The people do not truly know him, but they remember the First Empire, and in their nostalgia, they imagine a greatness that might return. So he wins, not with bullets, but ballots. As president, Louis Napoleon is measured, watchful. He knows France is weary of uncertainty. He speaks of order, of prosperity, of national pride. But he also senses something deeper, an ache for grandeur, for unity, for a story big enough to hold all the small, aching disappointments of daily life. And slowly he begins to gather power. He offers stability in exchange for obedience, hope, in exchange for submission, and in 1851, when his term nears its end, he stages a coup d'état, dissolves the assembly, rewrites the constitution, and assumes control. There is resistance, but it is scattered. The people, remembering chaos, prefer calm even if it is a calm built by decree. 1 year later, he declares himself Emperor Napoleon III. You drift through a different kind of empire now. This is not the thunder of Austerlitz or the lightning of conquest. This is a quieter, more bureaucratic grandeur. Paris is reshaped. Old, winding alleys give way to grand boulevards. The city becomes a symbol of modernity, of light, of France as something sleek and civil. Baron Haussmann tears down and rebuilds, and through the dust rises a new face for the capital. There are fountains, gaslights, promenades. Industry grows. Railroads stitch the country into a tighter fabric. The middle class expands, and for a time, it feels as if progress might replace poetry. But beneath the surface, something uneasy hums. Napoleon III is not his uncle. He lacks the charisma, the genius, the military mystique. His power is real, but it is built on illusion. He allows some press freedom, but censors often follow. He holds elections, but the outcomes are rarely in doubt. And while he speaks often of national pride, the working poor remain in the shadows. The countryside still aches with inequality. Abroad, he seeks glory to match his name, first in the Crimean War, then disastrously in Mexico, where he tries to install a puppet emperor, only to lose him to rebellion and execution. And then comes the final stumble. Prussia in 1870, Napoleon III is drawn into a conflict. He underestimates Eager to reassert French prestige. He declares war on Otto von Bismarck, a cunning master of manipulation. What follows is the Franco-Prussian War, a brief and brutal unraveling. French armies are ill-prepared. Within weeks, Napoleon III is captured at Sedan, humiliated, and taken prisoner. His empire collapses like a curtain pulled too fast. The illusion vanishes. You drift through a stunned Paris, where the empire's end arrives with no applause, no farewell, just the cold breath of defeat. And yet something remarkable happens. Out of that silence, France does not turn to another king. It does not call for a new emperor. Instead, it proclaims a new beginning, the Third Republic. This time, the Republic does not begin with blood. It begins with memory. It remembers the guillotine, the revolution, the empires, the exiles. It remembers how power, when wrapped too tightly around one man, can crush the very people it claims to protect. It remembers how promises fade beneath marble and gold. And so this time, France chooses not spectacle, but endurance. You walk now through the slow rise of democratic institutions, imperfect but resilient. The press grows bolder. Education becomes secular and wide-reaching. The military, though proud, is placed under civilian command. France is still torn by tensions between left and right, between church and state, between capital and labor, but it is also learning how to argue without collapsing. You pass through the Paris Commune of 1871, a brief, radical experiment born from war and starvation. You see the barricades rise once more, the red flags, the chants, the fierce, flickering dream of a workers' city, and you witness its brutal suppression, thousands killed in the streets by the new Republican army. The Republic survives, but with blood on its hands and lessons to learn. And yet through all this, it endures. It becomes not a moment, but a structure, a habit, a rhythm. France grows not through coronations, but through classrooms, not through battles, but ballots. The Republic begins to take root in hearts, in daily life, in the quiet rituals of civic belonging. People begin to believe not in men, but in principles, not in glory, but in dignity. Napoleon III dies in exile, just like his uncle, not in a palace, but in a foreign house in England, writing memoirs few read. And with his death, the cycle breaks. No more emperors rise. The Republic, bruised but breathing, stays. You lie down now in the long shadow of centuries. France has passed through monarchy, revolution, empire, and back again. But with each turn, it has carried something forward, an idea, a possibility, a question. What does it mean to be a people? To govern not from a throne, but from a table shared by many voices? The answer is not yet complete, but France has begun to ask it with clarity. And in asking, it becomes something new, not perfect, not final, but enduring. You close your eyes beneath a flag that no longer hides a sword behind it. You sleep beside a nation still learning to listen to itself. The last emperor has vanished. The Republic remains. And somewhere beyond the boulevards and rooftops of Paris, the sky begins to lighten. France does not dream of kings anymore. It dreams of something quieter, and perhaps more real. Now the winds have calmed, and France settles into something slower, something steadier. You walk through a country that no longer turns on kings, or cheers for emperors, or waits for revolutions to start. Instead, it listens. It listens to its own footsteps, its own voice. It learns to carry history not as a weapon, but as a whisper. This chapter is not about war or power. It is about something gentler, how a nation learns to remember itself, without being ruled by the remembering. You move now through the stone bones of France's cathedrals, fortresses, gardens, libraries. The past is carved into the walls. You run. your fingers along grooves left by centuries of belief and blood. In Chartres, the stained glass still glows with medieval light. In Carcassonne, the towers still wear the armor of the Crusades. In Mont Saint-Michel, the tides still carry pilgrims like they did 1,000 years ago. But the people who walk among them now come not as subjects or soldiers, but as citizens. They carry backpacks, not banners. They take photographs, not orders. They live with history not beneath it. In Paris, the streets are no longer shaped by revolution. They are shaped by rhythm. Cafés buzz with philosophy not born in salons but in daily life. People speak Voltaire's defiance without knowing it. They argue Rousseau's freedom at lunch. The Republic is no longer an idea, fought for it is a habit, a system, a pulse in the infrastructure. Children go to school not to memorize monarchs, but to learn to think, to vote, to speak. France, for the first time in centuries, learns how to be ordinary, and that, in itself, becomes something extraordinary. But even now, shadows return. In 1914, the peace cracks. You float through the trenches of World War I, where young men lie beneath the mud of memory. France becomes battlefield once more. Fields in the north become open wounds. At Verdun, soldiers hold the line for months in horror and silence. You hear the groan of industry-turned monstrous machines built not to lift, but to kill. The Republic survives, but it limps. And then, again, in 1939, the world falls into fire. World War II arrives like thunder over broken glass. You pass through. A France divided, some fighting, some collaborating, many simply surviving. The German occupation turns cities into cages. Paris becomes a haunted place, but resistance blooms in the cracks. You hear the footsteps of couriers delivering secret messages. You feel the press of underground newspapers, the defiant whisper of radio waves carrying hope. And when the liberation comes in 1944, it is not just a military event, it is a reclaiming of self. After the war, France begins, again tired, but wiser. It loses its colonies, one by one, learning to let go of an empire it no longer needs. Algeria, Vietnam, Sub-Saharan, Africa, each departure painful, each necessary. France begins to look inward, to ask not what it can conquer, but what it can become. It rebuilds itself, not through royalty or conquest, but through democracy, through debate, through slow, stubborn reform. You walk now through modern France. The train glides from city to city. Wind turbines turn on the hills. Artists still gather in Montmartre. Philosophers still drink coffee in Saint-Germain. Farmers plant in the same soil where Roman boots once marched. Children laugh in playgrounds, beside medieval walls. And though the faces change, the rhythm does not. The heartbeat of France still carries echoes of everything that came before. You feel it in the language, in the way people say republic with pride and gravity, in the way they remember the revolution not as a single spark, but as a constellation of values, in the way they argue at dinner tables, not to divide, but to define. Freedom here is not just a lit, as a flavor, a style, a way of moving through the world, and yet memory still stirs beneath the cobblestones. In the museums you find the silks of monarchs, the swords of revolutionaries, the ashes of old ideals. In the countryside you see plaques on village walls, names of boys who never returned from the front. In cemeteries, roses grow beside the graves of kings and commoners. Alike, history is not past. Here it is laid lived with, touched, told. France has found something deeper than stability. It has found continuity. It no longer remakes itself in fire. It slowly adjusts the mirrors. It corrects its posture. It softens the hard lines of old glory into the curves of civic life. The people vote, they protest, they reform, and through it all they remember. You sleep now beside the slow breath of a country that has known itself in so many forms, as kingdom, as republic, as empire, as dream. Each form carried beauty, each carried pain. But now, France does not wear any single face. It wears all of them at once, like a portrait layered in memory. And when you close your eyes, you hear it not drums, not cheers, not cannon fire. You hear footsteps in a library, a page turning, a bell in a village, the laughter of children in a schoolyard, the murmur of a river beneath a Roman bridge. This is France now, not just a nation that remembers, but a nation that remembers how to live. The world spins faster now, and France spins with it, not with swords or songs, but with satellites, debates, and cities full of every kind of voice. You rise into a France that no longer needs to prove its greatness through empires or thrones. It has traded its banners for ballots, its palaces for policies. The Republic stands, not untouched by trouble, but anchored by time. It has survived itself, and now it begins to grow not outward, but inward into a more layered, inclusive version of what it means to be French. You walk the wide boulevards of Paris, but they no longer echo with the clatter of cavalry. They carry footsteps from every corner of the earth. West African rhythms hum in the suburbs. Arabic call to prayer rises beside the bells of old cathedrals. Vietnamese restaurants steam beside Napoleonic facades. France is no longer a singular story. It is a tapestry woven from centuries of movement and memory. The Republic has learned to hold more than one truth at once. It remembers Joan of Arc and the resistance, but also the wounds of Algeria, the lessons of Haiti, the long echoes of colonization. The story of France is no longer told only in marble, but in music, in film, in languages shared across tables and parks. You drift into a classroom where children trace their fingers across maps of the world and speak French in accents shaped by Dakar, Beirut, Martinique. The secular schools of the Republic still carry the promise of equality, but now they must balance that promise with diversity. The challenge is no longer how to rule, but how to include, and the answer does not come quickly. Debates crackle across the airwaves. What does it mean to be French? To wear a veil, to speak with an accent, to pray or not pray. These are not problems to be solved in a single law. They are part of France's new fabric. Threads pulled taut, sometimes tangled, always evolving. You pass through the countryside too, where tradition still blooms slowly. Lavender fields stretch through Provence, baguettes still crisp in village ovens. There is comfort here, rituals that persist through change. Market days, long meals, conversations that last until the wine is gone and the sun has dipped behind. The rooftops, in these quiet places, France whispers to itself in the same tongue it has always used, soft, careful, deeply aware of time. But even in these places, the modern world knocks. Wind turbines rise behind vineyards. Tourists photograph traditions as they happen. Farmers use smartphones to track the weather. France remains ancient in its roots, but its branches reach into the future. High-speed trains thread the country, like veins. Paris becomes a capital not of kings, but of conferences, of climate pacts, of literature prizes and fashion weeks. The Republic of Letters becomes the Republic of Ideas, always writing itself forward. You drift into the halls of science. France gave the world Pasteur, Curie, Descartes, but now new names emerge: immigrant daughters coding for space missions, sons of refugees pioneering green energy. The Republic opens laboratories instead of battlefields. It explores the genome instead of empires. And it does so with quiet conviction, rooted in the idea that knowledge is not just power, it is liberation. Yet even here, the shadows stretch. France faces what all old countries face: the pull of memory, the ache of identity, the scars that linger beneath progress. Terrorist attacks shake the cities. Far-right voices grow louder, whispering old fears in new clothing. Economic uncertainty rattles communities. Protests rise. The Gilets Jaunes fill the streets with fluorescent anger, crying out not against a monarchy, but against inequality, against feeling unseen. France, like every modern nation, finds that technology does not erase injustice, it merely illuminates it faster. And still, the Republic endures. Not because it is perfect, not because it is finished, but because it is self-correcting. It debates openly. It remembers painfully. It reforms, rewrites, resists always from within. The Constitution changes. The presidents change. The faces on the currency, the flags flown at marches, the slogans on city walls all shift. But beneath them flows the same deep idea that liberty, equality, and fraternity are not relics of the revolution, but practices daily, deliberate, and unfinished. You walk now beside the River Seine, where the lights of the Eiffel Tower shimmer not as symbols of conquest, but of continuity. Lovers kiss on bridges, artists sketch under the trees. Children chase pigeons past bookstores. The Republic is not some grand fortress, is 1,000 quiet freedoms lived every day. And you realize something. France has finally become what it always tried to be. Not a king's garden, not a soldier's map, but a country where thought and spirit can stretch without permission, where memory is honored but never allowed to chain the future, where you can stand on the same ground that held revolutions, crusades, coronations, and simply breathe. You lie down now beneath the soft hum of a modern France. It is not sleeping, it is becoming. It is still arguing with itself, still reaching, still remembering. But now it remembers forward. You have come a long way through history's corridors. You've walked beside queens in shadowed halls, stood at the foot of guillotines, marched with revolutionaries, and watched emperors rise and vanish into the mist. You've seen France remade, again and again, not just on maps, but in the mind. And now, at the edge of this long path, the rhythm slows, not because the story ends, but because it deepens. France no longer dreams of becoming an empire. It dreams of becoming itself. You lie beneath skies that once rang with cannon fire and now carry only the hush of clouds. There is no war tonight, no coronation, just the gentle stir of wind in a city that never quite sleeps. Paris glows softly below its bridges, arched, like arms embracing centuries, its lamplit streets echoing with the footsteps of poets and bakers, teachers and tourists. The grandeur has quieted, and in its place, a kind of wisdom. France is no longer ruled by thrones or theories. It is ruled by memory and the courage to question that memory. The Republic it holds today is not an answer, but a framework. It does not pretend to be perfect. It never has. It wrestles with its past not to erase it, but to understand how it shapes the present. Statues still stand, but plaques beneath them whisper new truths. Museums grow, not only with paintings, but with reflection. The story is still being written, not with ink alone, but with action. You pass through its regions now, not as provinces of a king's court, but as voices in a national chorus. Normandy's coast, with its quiet waves and heavy memories. Brittany's cliffs, where language still curls in Celtic syllables. Marseille, sunlit squares, where the Mediterranean meets Africa in every face, every song. France is not a fixed shape, it's a field of living textures, ancient and new, elegant and earthy. The Republic does not erase these differences. It learns to live with them. The world outside France keeps turning. Crises cross borders. Climate shifts reshape forests and vineyards. Migration flows faster than policy. The internet speaks in every voice at once. And yet, within this restless world, France holds to something quieter, a kind of cultural gravity. It still values beauty, but not just for display. It reads slowly. It argues fiercely. It protects its cheese, its language, its secularism, not as symbols of superiority, but as threads in a deeply woven selfhood. The past is not always comfortable here, but it is always close. You listen now to France breathing. It does not roar. It invents, it writes, it remembers. It sends philosophers into cafés and comedians onto television. It debates everything from identity to immigration to the curvature of croissants. It mourns loudly, protests passionately, but also celebrates with quiet defiance, the kind that turns streets into stages and parks into poetry. Even when frightened, even when fractured, France turns toward expression. In tragedy, it sings. In confusion, it reasons. In change, it paints. The Enlightenment never truly ended, simply put down its quill and picked up a camera, a laptop, a microphone. And this is how you know. The soul of France is not found in its rulers, but in its resilience. Not in monuments, but in moments. The child learning Rousseau in a dusty schoolroom. The baker shaping dough before dawn. The woman voting with memory. In her hands, the immigrant building a life beside Roman ruins. The old man playing chess beneath a tree planted before his grandfather's time. You reach now the soft edge of this story, the place where history turns into breath, and breath turns into rest. There is no final king, no last revolution. France is not finished. It is not static. It is a republic of light and shadow, thought and tradition, hesitation and boldness. It is still becoming, and as you close your eyes, the weight of centuries settles gently around you, not as pressure, but as presence. France does not ask to be loved or feared. It asks only to be remembered truthfully. It is not the crown it once wore. It is not the empire it once chased. It is a mirror, polished by time, reflecting a people still learning to see themselves clearly. You fall asleep in that mirror. You rest in a land where the past hums quietly beneath the streets, where the future is not a promise, but a conversation, and where the dream has never been perfection, only the freedom to begin again. And now the candles have burned low. The crowds have gone quiet. The banners that waved through storms of war and revolution flutter gently in the dusk of memory. The kings are gone. The emperors sleep. Even the guillotine once, sharp and sure, has grown dull with time. France does not shout anymore. It breathes. It remembers. So as you drift deeper into sleep, carry with you the wind-arc rivers, the soft cathedral bells, the pages of philosophy left open on cafe tables. Let the rhythm of this place rock you gently as it has rocked itself through centuries of change. Not to teach you anything tonight, but simply to remind you that history, like sleep, is always waiting to return. Softly, slowly, sweetly. Bonne nuit. France will keep dreaming. And so will you.